Welcome back. It's the Better Learning Podcast, and we're always trying to bring some different perspectives into education from different aspects. And today I have Mike Beckham with me, and I should have asked you before. Did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Yeah, you got it. Just like the soccer player, right?
Perfect. Yeah. I mean, you got a lot of similarities in there, right?
Yeah.
The athletic skills.
About that, and I tell people, yeah, he's my less athletic cousin.
But the reason we invite you in, and thank you for coming on the show, is you're taking a different perspective and taking some of the things from entrepreneurial side, but really it was something that we talk about a lot is the mission, and hearing you and listening to you on other podcasts and your podcast as well. I've just been impressed in the mission and how the idea that companies can be a force for good. And that's really where we were hoping to have a lot of the conversation today. But would you mind starting out and give a little bit of your journey? And I like asking the question to get things started of what was school like for you?
Yeah. I think for me, school, I always did pretty well in school, but I think I had the mentality of trying to do the bare minimum, honestly. And I'd always taken standardized tests pretty well. So in high school, I got a score on my SAT that meant that I could get a full ride to college, and ended up taking that at the University of Oklahoma. And even the first couple of years, I really thought it was cool that I could show up late to a class, or I could not go to a class between tests and pull an all-nighter. And it wasn't until the end of college that I started to realize how immature that perspective was. And especially as I moved into my adult life, I started to really develop, I think, a love of learning and an understanding that learning is what brings a richness to life. And probably a transformational moment. So one of the phrases I would use for that is that I developed a growth mindset. And I think over the course of my career, I've done some very disparate things, but that thread of enjoying learning and enjoying challenging myself has run through all of those different things. And as a result, it's kind of created a very unique career arc and a unique story.
So you learned it earlier than I did. It took me until I was after college to realize, I was not doing school to learn. I was doing school just because that's what you're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And then it hit me later. I'm like, oh, I actually want to go back and do some schooling, but with my personal goals applied to it.
Yeah.
And it had a totally different perspective of it. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. And then, so you've been on this entrepreneurial journey, but you didn't jump right into that. Started out more kind of nonprofit ministry. What was that career like when you say hey, I'm graduating from college, now I got to enter the real world? What was your thought process like?
Yeah, really the short answer there is I thought I was going to work in finance. I was engaged. My wife had one more year of college, and so there was going to be a little bit of a gap year where we were still going to be in Norman, and I was looking for what was I going to do during that gap year, and an opportunity presented itself to do full-time ministry. I would not have guessed when that happened that 1 year would turn into 2, which would turn into 10, and I ended up spending my entire 20s working in the nonprofit world, raising my salary, working with college students, mentoring people. That was not on my bingo card, but it's what ended up happening. And, I just loved it. I learned how much I enjoyed being able to pour my time into others. And I got a lot better at leading group discussions. I got a lot better at initiating with people. I got a lot better, I think, at being introspective with myself. I developed a much stronger kind of worldview and a series of personal values. And all of these things ended up mattering tremendously as I got into my 30s and 40s. I think one of the things that we don't communicate enough to people in their teenage and early 20s years is that this is a period for you more than anything else to form the dream for your life and what you think is really important about life, what makes life worth living. And having a really strong sense of that is going to help you to be successful. It's going to give you a foundation of stability and purpose that you can use as you get into your adult life. And so that was really a gift I got from working in the nonprofit world, is that I developed all of those things as the as fate would have it, my career unfolded and I've become an entrepreneur, I've realized that my ability to do so, especially in a purposeful way, has been completely transformed by the years in my 20s where I was in nonprofit work. So a lot of times I'll talk to students about entrepreneurship, and I will say, you would never chart out a career the way that mine has gone. You would never say, if you at 45, if you wanted to be running a company that's this size with this many employees that you had founded, what are you doing right out of college? No one would say, go work in a job where you raise your salary, go work in a job that has nothing to do with selling, and has to do with investing in other people. But ironically, that was exactly what I needed to prepare myself to be excellent in entrepreneurship and to be excellent in the business world.
But it's not that uncommon. Like I'm with you. Like I got that entrepreneurial bug that's been my track as well. And listening to the episode that you recorded with your wife, Heather, I just actually sent that to my wife. And I'm like, doesn't this sound familiar?
Yeah.
A lot of similarities in there. But I've also talked to a lot of friends who are entrepreneurs, and one in particular, Angela Petro, phrased it to me that really helped. And she's like, what entrepreneurs do, that if there's a superpower, it's the ability to combine two things that seem like they are not connected at all into a way we're connecting it. And it sounds like that's similar to what you've done. Like that experience, maybe it wasn't the original intention of I'm going to go, do nonprofit mission type of work because that's going to help me become an entrepreneur, but being able to combine some of those principles, typically, like those are the things that make that entrepreneurial journey what it is.
Yeah, I mean, entrepreneurship is not the easiest life path. Usually, to do entrepreneurship, you have to have people skills, you have to have business skills, quantitative skills, and there are a lot of ways that you can make your living, which would be less stressful, more stable. And so it's a great question of why would anybody do entrepreneurship? And the answer usually is not that they just want to have a lot of money. There are people like that are just like, I want to produce an extreme financial outcome, and entrepreneurship seems like the best way. But a lot of entrepreneurs, it's ideological. Mm-hmm. It's what drives them is a vision of how the world could look, and a product that could be that isn't yet, and a way that customers could be served, or the way that things should work, and that they're a lot more like missionaries than mercenaries. This is a Jeff Bezos thing, that early on in Amazon, they wanted to hire missionaries, not mercenaries. And what he was really trying to communicate is not necessarily something spiritual, but he was trying to communicate something about the ideology of the people that they tried to build Amazon with. And this is the ideology of most entrepreneurs, which is there is a belief level reason why you're in it, why you don't just go take the safer corporate job. And it's that belief mission level drive that keeps you in it when it is tough, that makes you willing to put the money on your own credit card and to lay things on the line. And I think that definitely was true for me. Like you said, that this is counterintuitive, but in my experience, a lot of entrepreneurs are, some of the most belief mission driven people that I know. And that they've chosen to use their skills in building companies.
I'm going to talk like it's some type of a problem. But what were the earliest signs for you that you're like, I might be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's super interesting about my story is that I would not have described myself as an entrepreneur until probably my late 30s. And in my market, I think our company and me have become kind of the poster child for, hey, this is an example of entrepreneurship. And yet that wasn't even my own self-view. Really, in a lot of ways, I had to develop that confidence from seeing my brother start a company that I helped him start, and being around other entrepreneurs and gradually kind of starting to feel comfortable with the idea that I could do this, that I had the ability and the skills to do this. But that didn't come easily. And so I think it's worth anybody listening to this to know that everyone has self-doubt. No matter what your talent level or your aptitude for entrepreneurship, everybody has self-doubt. Can I really do this? Can I really create something? Can I really take the less safe path? And that was certainly part of my story. I think that what I did start to see as I started to do more business entrepreneurial things is I started to stumble upon a little bit of a secret, which was I'd been doing entrepreneurial things my entire life. I just hadn't framed it that way, and they hadn't been framed to me that way. Going on a date is entrepreneurship. Taking a new class is entrepreneurship. Watching a YouTube video to figure out how to do something, that's entrepreneurial, right? Running an experiment is entrepreneurial. And I started to realize like, oh, I've been a part of a ton of entrepreneurial things. It just never was framed that way to me. And I actually really like a lot of the things that entrepreneurs do. Entrepreneurs are first and foremost, they're kind of experimenters that love learning and love kind of decoding what's going on and what people want and how to serve people and how to create something that better solves a problem. And these were all things that I was already engaged in doing. I just wouldn't have defined it as entrepreneurship. So one of the big breakthroughs was just realizing that I just needed to map a lot of behaviors that I already did and processes that I already enjoyed to business, and that's pretty much what entrepreneurship was. So once I saw that, I was like, okay, that's a big kind of insight. I think I love learning. I love being surprised by data. I love experimenting, and I think that I saw pretty early on that I had this kind of rapacious appetite for learning and challenging myself. And that was another sign that like, okay, like entrepreneurship, like I think I've got the bug, and I don't know if there's any going back now.
I like the way you frame that though, because it really is going back to your term before. It's growth mindset. It's the idea that, I'm going to try to figure something out. I'm okay trying something new, learning from it, and either moving on or pursuing it at a deeper level. And, like there's a lot of schools that, have more of like entrepreneurial focus and things like that. But the reality is it's not just towards business. It's having more of that growth mindset to be able to do it. Cause I'm the same way. Like I look at it as more of these creative projects that I really liked over my career, whether they were businesses or not. And I really enjoyed listening to books like The Creative Act by Rick Rubin, who is a music producer. But to me, it is like entrepreneurship is like it's a form of creativity. It's a whole idea of just creating something that didn't exist and bringing it to the world.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. The expression of creativity, the ability to bring something into being out of nothing, it's hard to experience that in a lot of professions, and it's really gratifying for people that are like I had both the flaw and the strength of wanting to do that and being willing to give up like the safety that comes with other paths to see what I was capable of. I also think that there is something about entrepreneurship that really resonates with people that like to push themselves to see what they're capable of. I have this theory that, there's kind of two different types of people. There's people who say, how high a bar do I have to jump over to get what I want? And then there's a second smaller group that says, how high a bar am I capable of jumping over? And I'm just kind of obsessed with knowing what that answer is for me. And that entrepreneurship is a great endeavor for people like that because it's more of like an internally competitive dynamic. One other thing that, growing up, I loved working puzzles, and I just like solving problems. And in kind of its most atomic form, you could say that entrepreneurship is getting paid to solve problems. And so if you don't like solving problems, you're probably not going to like entrepreneurship. But if you do like solving problems, then it can be a great solution. And that was actually probably a pretty big unlock for me. There was a point where like I would see the problems in our business that needed to be solved. And I would feel this desire to hurry up and solve them as quickly as I could. And, like I'm going to solve them and eventually our business is going to have no problems. And then one day I realized if our business had no problems, I'd be bored to tears, and that like having interesting problems to work on is part of the appeal here to me. Like I love that I have interesting problems to work on. And I want that as part of my day-to-day. Like I think the fact that I love problem solving is another thing that made me well suited for doing entrepreneurship.
Perfect. Well, do you mind sharing, if you take us back to 2015, the founding story, because I think that's going to lead into, and I'm going to pull in specifically why we invite you on the show, because our audience of school leaders and people that support schools and the change makers in education, I think will benefit a lot from hearing your story, and we'll have some conversation about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one way of thinking about my career up until the point that I started Simple Modern is about half of it had been in the nonprofit world and about half of it had been working in the for-profit world. And then there was this period where I was doing both at the same time. And that both of those experiences deeply impacted me. I realized that I was a person that loved to solve problems and loved to create and was about excellence, but that I was also a person who deeply cared about values and purpose and mission and belonging and community. And those two things often pull against each other, and we don't see them expressed together. So the central question that I had is, would it be possible to create a really radically different type of company where both of those things were prioritized? And there were a couple of guys that had worked directly under me in this previous company that approached me at a lunch one day and just said, hey, if you ever started something, we would love to do it with you. And my response was, I would love to work with you guys. We have a great relationship where, we have the same values. Like, we have a similar vision of what it would look like to create, a really different type of culture, to create a company that's really about giving. I'd love to do it. And that became the beginning of Simple Modern, which we never would have dreamed would get to the scale that it's gotten to. But the easiest way to describe it is we spent a lot of time thinking about what would it be like to work inside of this company that we want to create, and what would it feel like? What would the mission be like if you belong to this company? And we spent a lot more time working on those things than what the company would do to fund it and what the company would sell. And that came later. So we started with, what will it feel like to work here? And what will we care the most deeply about? And then we asked the question, okay, what are we going to sell in order to fund that? So we knew a lot of the things, like our commitment to giving and the way that we were going to approach values and culture. We knew those things before we came up with that we were going to sell, water bottles and tumblers. That came later, and we're passionate about it, doing it. We do it at a level of excellence that I'm proud of. But those things are a means to an end. They exist, and we do them because they make the community and the mission of the company possible. So
that's interesting, because that is probably the exact opposite of almost every other entrepreneurial story that I hear, and I've had a lot, and I've talked to a lot. Like, to me, it usually starts with survival first, and then we find our way. Have you heard of others doing that? Like, were there any examples, things that you were looking at of like why you started there, or, like what was that driving force
how do you
to do that?
do
because
it?
Typically, like, everyone else is like, well, what's a business plan? What's a business plan? How are you going to make money? And then, and then you start being like, okay, well, now really what's our mission? Now, once we know we can survive.
There's a great quote in Jurassic Park where one of the characters says, you were so concerned with whether or not you could that you didn't stop to think about whether or not you should. And it really resonates with me because I'm a competitive person. I like problem solving. And it's easy for me, if I'm not careful, to work problems I shouldn't work, right? To spend my time and effort. This is one of the things that's about growth mindset. This is a great thing to actually say at this point. This is a podcast about learning. Growth mindset is not unambiguously positive, because just having a desire to learn doesn't get you all the way where you want to be. Having the desire to learn and the willingness to grow, plus the judgment of understanding where to apply that, that's what gets you where you want to be. And so I think that that's something that really informed the way that we approach the company. A lot of people are like, I'd love to be my own boss. I'd love to have financial independence. I'd love to be a part of creating things. And those are good things, but they don't necessarily think it all the way through of, if I was successful in those things, is it, like, am I intentionally designing this in a way where I would be proud of and I would enjoy working in the thing that I created? Famously, Reed Hastings, his first company, which he took public, I think it became a multi-billion-dollar company. He hated working in it by the end. And it became, Netflix has a very distinctive culture document. You can go and look this up online. But part of the impetus of Netflix's whole thought and emphasis on culture was that Reed Hastings had this kind of seminal experience of creating something that by the time it got really big, he didn't even recognize anymore. He didn't even want to be a part of it. And so I think being a part of building a couple of companies before Simple Modern, I'd made the mistakes, and I had seen the good and the bad that can happen when you create something without an exact picture of where you're trying to go. Like, just to use an analogy, building a company is oftentimes like trying to build a car while you're driving it. But building a company when you don't know the mission and the purpose is like building a car while you're trying to drive it without knowing where you're trying to drive. And that's just a bridge too far to do successfully. So one of the ways that we accomplish this is we didn't immediately quit our jobs. We stayed in our full-time jobs for a bit while we formulated the idea of what this would become and while we started to experiment. I think this is one of the things that's uniquely possible in today's environment, is that you rarely have to make the burn the ship decision at the very beginning anymore. Maybe you did need to, 50 years ago, maybe it required more of that thought process, but it doesn't today. You can find ways to run micro experiments, to start things, and in their embryonic state, not give up the day job and not rearrange your life until you've kind of proven the concept. So that was probably part of what enabled us to do it. It wasn't like, okay, we're going and getting the SBA loan, we're all quitting our jobs. Okay, it's day one, we have nothing figured out. Let's talk about culture. Another piece of it was that we had relationships that predated the company. So we had years of context that was really informing the way that we thought about some of these things. So it wasn't like we were starting from a blank sheet of paper. It was more like, hey, we've experienced in working with each other the type of environment we want to create. Let's codify that. Let's turn that into words so that we could communicate that to others, so that we could know that what we're hiring for. But we already had a pretty, I think, clear perspective of what it was that we were aiming for. So that's probably how we were able to achieve it. The one other thing I would say is we were really good at something. We were really, really good at e-commerce. And that makes it a lot easier. Even if we didn't know what we were going to sell, we knew a lot about how we would probably do it. And I think that obviously created a lot of freedom and flexibility for us, that we knew we had a skill that we had developed that we could leverage. And we had more room and time to figure out the specifics of how we were going to deploy that.
So tell me about that time where, so if you didn't quit your job and then start working on it, and you were running these experiments while you still kept your job, what was that moment like when you did have it? Was it just the logical next step, or did it feel like this is a big step? Like, what were those things that you felt like you had in place and you're like, okay, now I can?
Yeah, you feel confidence. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that it's a subjective thing that was somewhat about finances, somewhat about where the business was at, and somewhat about my focus and where I could, there was a point where it was clear that the business was not going to be able to get where it needed to be without more of my focus. So I think there were a lot of different factors that played into it. I mean, really, frankly, my wife played a big role in this. Like, I'm getting a lot of feedback from her, because when you try to do two things simultaneously, like the toll that will take at home is going to be heavier. And there were a lot of, like, that first year, one of the things that most people don't realize is that when we started the company, I had a 6-month-old daughter. Both of my co-founders had their first children in the first year of the company. So all three of us had kids under one in that first year. And there's obviously a ton of transition. So it's not at all how you would have drawn it up on paper. And to some extent, you're just day by day, you're trying to keep a pulse on your family and the company and saying, hey, what's realistic? And there was risk, when I went full time, that there was risk in doing it, but it felt like a calculated risk. And I think that that's probably the biggest advice I give to people is, entrepreneurship is all about risk, but what you're trying to do is make calculated risks where you feel like things are tilted in your favor. And I think by the time I went full time, I really felt like things were tilted, in our favor. It really looked like we we had some runway and we had clear product market fit.
So tell me, I always use the analogy of like, show me, like every overnight success and I'll show you 10 years of hard work behind that.
Yeah.
So, here you are in, 2024, in many ways, you guys, like, you have had a huge, growth span very fast, to people from the outside looking in and be like, wow, that's a huge success and really fast. I'm assuming the story behind that was not as linear as was. What were the moments, and I'm going to ask you specifically kind of around this date for a reason, about 2.5 years into it, let's say 2017. Mm-hmm. Did you have moments where you felt like, man, we're crushing it. This is exactly what we thought was going to happen. It was like immediate success.
Well, I mean, like you said, there's nothing, overnight success stories aren't a real thing, but for two reasons. One is that almost always there's years where you're toiling in relative obscurity. I mean, for my wife and I, it's so funny. For years we ran this company, and anybody we'd meet in our community or in the state, very few of them would be aware of the company. And then in the last 2 or 3 years, now everybody's aware of the company, and so it's very jarring for us, to go from relative anonymity to everybody knows what I do. But another reason why it's the overnight success story is not a real thing is that what you start to see is how all of the years before you start the company were actually the prologue. That developing the skills and the learnings and the habits and the relationships and the capital that ends up making it all possible, that goes back decades. One of the stories that I tell about our first 15 employees, 14 out of the first 15 employees I'd known for a decade or more.
Wow.
So the whole way that the company comes together in the first place is because of relationships I built long before I even knew I would do anything in e-commerce, long before I'd done anything in entrepreneurship with many of these. These went back to days in the nonprofit world. And so this is typically the case with successful businesses and successful founders, is that they have been doing the right thing for a long time, and that it eventually culminates. A good illustration here is trees. When you plant a tree, they have like a nursery rhyme about how trees grow. First they sleep. The first year they sleep, then they creep, and then they leap. And so if you've ever planted a tree, you've seen it. Like, you'll plant it and it just sits there for a year. And then the second year, there's a little bit of growth. And then you look at it like the third or fourth year, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, it just grew 6 feet. And it's because it's been establishing the roots. But you can't see, it's all, like an iceberg. It's all a little bit hidden. But then eventually there is this moment where it becomes obvious, and exposed to the outside world just how much has been going on. And that's what it's like building a company. Jim Collins wrote a book called Good to Great. And one of the things he talks about in there is that they went to all these companies that had gone through pretty stunning kind of turnaround transformations. And they asked the management, they said, what was the turning point? And the management would just say, I don't understand the question, basically. They were just like, there is no point. I don't understand what you're getting at. And so Collins developed this analogy that I love. I want you to imagine that you're a chicken in an egg. You're in an egg that has been laid, and you're a chicken. And so every day you wake up and you're in the egg. And there is a day that eventually you take your beak and you poke a little hole in the egg and you come out of the egg. From the outside world's perspective, the day you came out of the egg was this amazing moment. If you were a reporter, it's like chicken emerges from egg. But if you're the chicken, it's just another day. You've been there, you've been growing, you've been developing. That day looked a little bit different, but it was just another day in the progression. But to the outside world, it seems like this massive deal. This is what it's like to build a company. And you really learn that you have to disconnect your view of how your business is doing from the outside world, because the outside world's assessment of it is almost never going to be accurate. It's either going to be too high or too low. You really have to develop the kind of self-confidence and self-assuredness that you can evaluate the company. 2.5 years in, I'll tell you, we were really first starting to feel like we had a lot of runway. So I think one thing that happens at about that time period is you start to realize how big the market might be and that you have a lot of potential. But we also had our first like existential, this could take down the business moment, where we were simultaneously faced with the potential fragility of the business. And I think that moment, and I can tell the story if you want to hear it, but that moment led to us fundamentally transforming the business in kind of probably laying the foundation for what it would become today.
Yeah, let's hear that story.
So at that point, we started out by selling on the Amazon marketplace. And by 2017, I would say somewhere between 90, at least 85 to 90% of our profit really came from selling on Amazon. And we were going into the Christmas period, which meant we took all the money we had, all the money we could borrow, and we bought inventory with it. So we were prepared to have the biggest Christmas we'd ever had, and we needed to have the biggest Christmas we'd ever had. On the Monday of Thanksgiving week, which, Thanksgiving turns into Black Friday, and that's the kickoff of the holiday period, we woke up and found out that our Amazon account had been suspended, and we didn't know why. Amazon sends a very terse, vague email. It's a form letter. And the way that Amazon handles their suspensions is that they don't tell you why. They more phrase it like, you've done something wrong. We're not going to tell you what you've done wrong. If you want to appeal this, you have to tell us what you did wrong, and we'll tell you if you were right, and what you're going to do differently, and we'll tell you if you're right. So it's very, very intimidating. And I do think in recent years they've gotten a little bit better in this area. But, imagine just waking up overnight and thinking my entire business is at risk, and I don't even know why. And it set off a 48-hour period of us trying to figure out why Amazon was upset and to fix it so that we could still partake in holiday sales. And the first 24 hours I was fine. It was somewhere around Wednesday, or I guess it was Tuesday evening, where we still had not gotten the account reinstated. And, we were being told by our Amazon rep that we had, basically till about midday Wednesday, or it wouldn't happen because everybody goes home and does Thanksgiving. And it was probably the first point where I really felt scared, I would say. I felt, I don't know what to do here. And it's one of my favorite stories ever about the company. There were basically 3 people in the company that knew how to manage the Amazon catalog. And the only thing we could think of is that we're just going to rebuild our entire catalog. There's something in here that's triggering an algorithm or something. We're going to rebuild the entire thing. One of them was my co-founder, Brian. He was in Colorado. One of them was my coworker, Corbin, who he was in New York on vacation. So both of the other guys that knew anything about working with Amazon, they were on vacation. But obviously their family vacations are getting blown up by this. And so Brian has a flight back. He's going to be in the air on Tuesday night. So Corbin and I, he's in New York. I'm in Oklahoma. We start working at 5 o'clock on Tuesday, 5 p.m., to rebuild the catalog. And our coworkers, the team was about 15 people at the time. Our coworkers are kind of saying, hey, is there anything I can do to help? And we're like, I don't think so, because, you just don't know how to work with their system. But what ended up happening is everybody went home, and Corbin and I are working. As a side note, which makes this story even better, what I did not know is that Corbin had tickets to go see Hamilton with the original cast that night, and he just skipped to work on this. He never told anybody. This came out afterwards. But when you talk about having an ownership mentality, when you talk about having exceptional teammates, that's what it looks like. So anyway, Corbin and I are working on this, and everybody's on Slack with our team. About 5:30, somebody kind of pings in, to me directly, hey, is there anything I can do to help? I'd really like to help. And I thought, well, it's not much, but I come to think of it, you could do this one thing. And then, about 20 minutes later, somebody else independently comes and says, hey, is there anything I can do to help? And by about 7:30, organically, the entire team had come onto Slack and said, hey, what do we do? And it turned into our entire team, some at their houses, some at our office, working on rebuilding our entire catalog. And basically, we pulled an all-nighter as a group. At about 4 a.m, Amazon, for reasons that we don't know, just turned our entire catalog back on. And we were able to sell during that holiday season. But it was a seminal moment because it showed the backbone that the team had, but it also showed that we were over-dependent. on one source, and that we had a very clear and present danger if we were going to be completely dependent on one source. We had to grow our brand and we had to grow our distribution, and that ended up becoming the motivation for us to partner deeply with Target, with Walmart, with the Costco's of the world, all of these people that we sell with today. It really flowed, developing our own website. It flowed out of realizing Amazon's a great partner, but they cannot be 90% of our sales, or we're not running a business that's secure. So great memory that showed me a lot about what we were building and the culture that we had with our team, and also helped propel us to becoming the company we are today.
That's a great, just all hands on deck story moment. Yeah, I can see how that can be a turning point for a company or an organization. I'm gonna pause and pull in the audience on a couple just takeaways that I feel like are really important to them, because we do have a lot of school leaders that are listening, whether they're superintendents or they're on the track to become superintendents, principals. They're sitting in like a leadership position, and they may be wondering like, well, why are we talking about entrepreneurship? And it is for moments like these to find out like what it is. To me, there's two really big takeaways that I feel like. One is the relationships that happen before you're in that position are super important. So it's not like all of a sudden you need that title to be like, hey, now I'm principal or now I'm superintendent. It's those relationships that happen before that. And two, and the reason I specifically asked like 2.5 years in is the average superintendent tenure right now is 2.9 years. And if we look at it objectively, and this is really big, I feel like for the education community and really everyone to understand, is that the lens on leadership for running an organization like that, if you look at 2.9 years into it, is almost always going to be a failing grade. Almost always. And it's really important that everyone starts understanding that, including the superintendent being able to set that stage and set that expectation and be like, hey, for me to do what I need to do, we're going to have moments where it looks like we're not on the right track. And to be able to say, like, we're looking at the long term here. We're looking at the long term. I'm going to be building a pipeline of leadership. I'm like, the vision is longer than that 2.9 years. And so I appreciate hearing that story. Is everyone wants to hear and say the success, but unfortunately or fortunately, that success takes time. It has a longer horizon that we need to be looking at. So thank you for telling that.
Listen, you're making such a good point, and I'll just reinforce it. I have studied a lot of companies. I've studied a lot of organizations, and the piece that I just don't think there's any way around is if you want to build something special, you have to be willing to give a significant chunk of your life to it. And that if you're not willing to do that, you're going to be perpetually frustrated. You're going to ask why you keep trying thing after thing and you never feel like you're making the impact that you want. And I think that some of the reason for this is pretty straightforward, which is that leadership is not positional. It's relational and it's judgment. And relationships and judgment just take time to develop. And you have to give yourself and the people that you're leading time to develop the depth to create the special cultures and organizations that we want to create. And so that's, I would just emphasize that to everybody. And going back to the kind of missionary mercenary idea, the thing that defines missionaries is primarily how fervently they believe in something and their willingness to stick with it for a long period of time, even at great personal sacrifice. And I think that this is, again, transformational leaders, they stick. And they stick with things a long time, and it comes at a cost. And I wish I could say that there's another way to get to it, but there's just not. And when we set that expectation for leaders, I think we're setting them up to succeed. Another piece that I'll just mention about being the CEO that I think is very similar to being a superintendent. I've been the CEO of Simple Modern for 9 years, but I've probably had 4 or 5 different jobs. And what I've learned is as I do the job better, the job changes. And so I'm always on the frontier of my competence. And in a similar way, when you move into a role like a superintendent role or a principal role, you're going from a position of competence, this is what got you promoted, to incompetence. Like it's a part of the transition, and that it takes a while to start to develop competence in the new role, and that's usually in years, right?
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. Yep, great point there. We don't have a ton of time left, but I really want to spend some time in your point of like the culture and the culture shift and what you're building. Can you give the story of like why you exist as an organization?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Because I think that's going to be a great lead into like wrapping this all up.
Here's what I fundamentally believe. I fundamentally believe that my life is finite and short, but that meaning and purpose comes from using my life not just to chase my desires, but to improve the lives of other people around me. That nothing is more meaningful and nothing gives back enjoyment and joy quite the same way as giving. And so I've become obsessed with generosity, really. And when we started the company, we really wanted to build something based on generosity, and it's become our mission statement: we exist to give generously. And generosity is so much more than the fact that we give 10% back, of our profits annually to nonprofits. It's about creating a culture where every single person who interacts, every customer, every person in the community, every team member, every partner, that when they rub up against the company, they experience generosity and their life is enriched or improved in some way as a result. And so much of it has nothing to do with money. It has to do with the generosity of encouragement, the generosity of what we've learned in building the company, or the generous prices that we charge for our products. There's a 1,000 different ways that this could express itself. But I was captivated by the idea of, could you build a business where the focus was not how do I get the maximum amount of money in, but how do I do the maximum amount of outward impact? And what I think we found in the process is that you absolutely can. And not only can you do that, but that the world is hungry for leaders, and the world is hungry for organizations that have this kind of mindset. That every leader has the opportunity to transform the lives of people around them, and doing so is an act of generosity. It's an act of laying down your time, your desires, your freedom to improve and enrich the lives of other people. And that is an act of sacrifice, but it's also, I think, the most purposeful and gratifying thing that we can possibly do. So the way that I'm expressing this mission statement just so happens to be in the business world, but it could easily be in the nonprofit world. It could easily be working for a school. In every organization, in every walk of life, there is room for people who take a radical view of generosity. And what I know is that those people change people's lives. Those people are the people that get talked about when you say, hey, who's the person that really made the biggest impact in the way that you see the world and in your life? And so I want to be that kind of a person. But more than that, I wanted to build a company that could be an example and a standard bearer, that there is a different way you can do things. And that's what we're trying to do. So mission statements: we exist to give generously.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a great way to wrap things up into the final point that I would like to make to our audience is that culture and that mission matters. People need to know why they're doing it. And like for us, like we always say, we're a mission-driven organization out to improve education and learning environments in particular. Like we take a radically student-centered approach. And knowing that for us to really make a dent in improving education in this country, it's an education system for a reason. Obviously, it happens a lot of times inside the walls of the school, and the superintendents and principals have a lot of say in that, and the teachers and all the community members have a big say on that. But there needs to be some cohesion of like, what are we doing? What's our mission? And what is that? And the best leaders are the ones that really do drive that. And it goes all the way through the entire community. So the ones that are doing that and doing that well are great examples for others, but don't forget that there's the rest of the ecosystem that's there. There are the companies that are mission driven. Like entrepreneurship, business is like one of my passions. Of like, could be one of the greatest forces for good. And we see a lot of companies like yours, Mike, and a lot of the ones that are in the education market that we're not doing this for profit. Yes, we need to make a living,
Right.
but give us the benefit of the doubt that we can be part of that solution too, because there are a lot of good companies, a lot of good organizations that just generally want to be part of that ecosystem that's going to drive that change. So,
absolutely, a short coda to what you're saying. People don't get into education primarily for selfish reasons. They get into it because they want to change people's lives.
Yeah.
And we all want to be able to draw a straight line from the way that we used our time in our career to the things that are meaningful. And what great leadership is helping people to make that connection in their minds and their heart. And you will be shocked at the ends that people will go to when they really truly believe that that's happening. And that's, as leaders, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help them to see how what they're doing on an hour by hour basis actually matters and is bigger than themselves. And once we unlock that, the real truly transformational things happen.
Perfect. Mike, thank you so much. To the listeners, if you have not hit subscribe, please subscribe wherever you're listening to, and please share these messages with people that that also care about education and care about leadership, and know that this is not just a school issue. This is how do we all improve education, because we all feel like every kid should have the best opportunity to succeed. So betterlearningpodcast.com is the hub for everything. Mike, thank you so much. It's great talking to you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Kevin.
The views and opinions expressed on the Better Learning Podcast are those of myself as an individual and my guests, and do not necessarily represent the organizations that we work for, the Association for Learning Environments, K-12, Education Leaders Organization, or Second Class Foundation.